"Attention, tanks, forward!" We all stood waiting for that moment. Our eyes were fixed on the hands of the clock. 8 at dawn, the engines of the vehicles roared. We increased speed, went faster and faster and faster, all the way to the border. I listened intensely to the silence of the morning twilight. At any moment, clearing our way to the east, the first shells of our artillery were to begin their deadly flight. Suddenly hisses, howls, and shrill screeches hung over us, giving the impression of even greater speed of our own, which we felt with every nerve. As we approached the border, we cast cursory glances at our assault teams, while they moved swiftly toward the border fences and destroyed the obstacles with high explosive charges. Machine gun fire swept down the street, and short blinding flashes of exploding grenades illuminated the targets. Our tanks and armoured vehicles burst into the village of Gola at full speed. Infantry assault squads captured the bridge over the Prozna River. It had already been prepared to be blown up and fell into our hands unharmed. In a matter of minutes, the village was occupied. Polish soldiers climbed out of their positions, dazed and stunned, and came towards us with their hands raised. They did not yet fully believe that only 10 minutes after the fighting had begun, the war was over for them. I stopped in front of the body of a Polish officer. A bullet had pierced his throat. Warm blood was gushing from the wound. Yes, it was war. This first death I saw in this war, with all clarity imprinted in my mind its grim reality. But we had to move on. The uprooted trees and burned-out houses made it difficult to advance. We could hardly distinguish the road. The fog rising from the ground mixed with smoke from shell and bomb explosions. I could not stay with the regimental headquarters. Having passed Gola, I moved forward with a reconnaissance patrol. Of course, as commander of the SS company of tank fighters, I had completely different duties. An attack by enemy tanks was not expected, and besides, my company was distributed in parts between the individual battalions of our regiment. I was not satisfied with this nature of fighting, so I secretly followed the advancing tanks. Since 1934, I had watched the development of tanks as weapons at the exercises at Doberitz and later at Wunsdorf and Zossen. Now I found myself in the war as a tank fighter. The billowing dust and fog still hung in the air when I saw 2 of our tanks and a motorcycle platoon. Visibility was less than 300 meters. Suddenly, the ominous silence was interrupted by the impact of a shell from a Polish anti-tank gun. The first tank spun around and, covered in smoke, stood up. Its rollers were still spinning when the second tank was also hit. Both our tanks were about 150 meters away from the anti-tank gun, whose position was well camouflaged. Shell after shell pierced the armor of our tanks, and machine gun bursts watered the street, forcing us to seek cover. We could hear the screams of the scout tank crew and were forced only to watch, unable to come to our aid. Each time a new shell penetrated the armor and penetrated inside the tank. The screams of our mortally wounded tankers who remained inside grew louder. We tried to help our comrades who managed to leave the hit tanks and get out from under fire, but it was impossible. The enemy's machine guns were pounding down the street. Their fire moved after the tankers who managed to get out of their broken and burning vehicles. The screams of those who remained in the hit tanks grew fainter. I was lying behind a pile of gravel. As fascinated, I looked at the blood oozing from the holes in the armor of the first tank. I was as if paralyzed. I could not see those Polish soldiers who fired, but my comrades were already lying dead right in front of me. The Polish cavalry galloped out of the fog. It was coming straight at us, and it was not stopped by the fire of my Mr. 38 rifle. Only when the fire of the motorcycle platoon mowed down several horses and riders did the fierce cavalry troop gallop back into the fog. Our artillery worked the heights in front of us, while the Grenadier tank battalion stormed the enemy positions. The young grenadiers moved as if they were on a drill. They could not be stopped by either machine gun or artillery fire. Countless what seemed to be a multitude of soldiers were marching, supported by tanks, to attack the enemy. I watched, amazed, as the attack passed right in front of me. The tanks were rushing forward. As the attack escalated, The Poles were swept away from their positions. The advance continued, almost unopposed. Neither the enemy nor natural obstacles could stop it. Each of the advancing German soldiers was convinced of the justice of this war and did not hesitate to give his life for the rights of his people. For these young soldiers, the war with Poland was not a war of aggression, but the removal of injustice. They wanted to eliminate the shameful legacy of Versailles, to regain the territories lost in 1919 and to stop the oppression of the Germans, who had become a people divided by borders. The German soldiers drew their strength from their aspirations. These young men were the nation's elite. They were selected from thousands of volunteers and underwent intensive training for 4 years. The SS regiment Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler was recruited from soldiers who were 19 years old at the outbreak of war. Non-commissioned officers were about 25 years old. Obviously, these young men had no influence on the political events of 1933. In 1933, they were still schoolboys, aspiring to some ideals and willing to devote themselves to the service of those ideals. How were they thanked? What bad publicity about themselves did they have to endure? And how are they treated even now? But on September 1, 1939, these soldiers could not have known that in a few years they would become scapegoats for evil politicians. They were honest soldiers doing their duty as befits a Prussian soldier. At about 10:00 a.m., the town of Boulogne surrendered after a furious assault and street fighting. The enemy's artillery fire rained down on this settlement in a hail, causing casualties among the population. By nightfall, we were already near Warsaw and were preparing the attack for the next morning. The SS motorized regiment Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler was attached to the 17th Infantry Division and was to cover its right flank from possible attacks of the Polish Cavalry Brigade. The impending darkness concealed the destruction wrought during the day. The horrible picture of the battlefield was only visible up close. On the horizon rose the glow of burning villages. Thick smoke drifted over the desecrated land. We sat silently behind a half-destroyed wall, trying to comprehend the first day of fighting, and listened to excerpts from Hitler's historic speech. I have decided to resolve the question of Danzig and the Polish corridor, and to find a way to make sure that a change in relations between Germany and Poland will make peaceful coexistence between us possible. The Führer's words echoed in our ears for a long time. Our regiment again entered the battle over the Water River as part of the 17th Infantry Division and advanced in the direction of Pabianice near Lodz. On September 7, at about 10:00 a.m., we reached the outskirts of Pabianice and were ordered to take up defences to the south along the hills stretching across Rozgó-Wola, Rakowa and Lodz. A considerable enemy force with anti-tank assets occupied Pabianice. An attack by the 1st Battalion of the 23rd Tank Regiment had just been repulsed by the Poles holding the defences. Our damaged and broken tanks remained on the battlefield. They were put out of action by Polish anti-tank guns. The motorized regiment Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler continued the combat mission and immediately began the assault. The 1st and 2nd companies stormed the town, followed by other units. This fierce attack forced the Poles to retreat to the centre of the city, but then against the advanced flanks of the regiment followed powerful counterattacks of the enemy. The 2nd Battalion of the 46th Artillery Regiment held its firing positions with all its might, repulsing the persistent counterattacks of the Polish infantry. The Polish units were moving forward at breakneck speed, not counting their losses. The regiment's command post suddenly became the site of the main attack. All clerks and drivers also had to fight. The Poles came to the command post through a potato field, and as the home provided excellent camouflage and concealed the attackers, we could not see them until they were within grenade-throwing distance. It seemed impossible to stop the enemy coming closer and closer. Then I jumped to my feet and from a standing position began to shoot at the potato field. This was the only way to hit the crawling Poles. On my right, a grenadier from the 13th Company was firing at them as if he were at a firing range. Line after line. Our target shooting did not last long. Suddenly I found myself again at the bottom of the trench. thrown there by a bullet that had grazed my shoulder. My neighbour had been killed, receiving a bullet wound in the neck. Never again would I try to stop an attack from a standing position. The attacks continued with tenacity shown on both sides, and it was not until near evening that the moment came when the poles were broken. They surrendered by the hundreds and embarked on the long journey prepared for prisoners of war. Meanwhile, the XVI Tank Corps approached Warsaw and engaged in battle with Polish units and formations defending the city, as well as with the remnants of Polish troops breaking through to the east. General Gepner, commander of the Tank Corps, welcomed the forward units of our regiment to Nadarsin. We were attached to the 4th Panzer Division of this corps. Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler was ordered to hold the line Caputi, Oltarziu, Domanev, and not to let the Polish units coming out of the encirclement to break through from the west to Warsaw. While on the march, the 1st Battalion of the SS Motorized Regiment Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler was ordered to change direction and move north to Oltarziu. The motorized infantry followed the motorized units, tanks and armoured vehicles. The columns of our troops disappeared into the night. General Gepner had no doubts about the outcome of the war in Poland, but foresaw heavy fighting for his XVI Tank Corps. He believed that the Polish troops, still fighting in an encirclement west of Warsaw, will make every effort to break through our positions to the capital. After a few kilometers, it became obvious that the coming night would bring heavy fighting. We had to fight our way through the suburbs of Warsaw. From Oltarziu came the loud noise of battle. The 1st Battalion of the SS Regiment Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler had reached the main deployment line and was fighting with significant enemy forces. On the road, the retreating Polish columns were closing in on each other and a complete jam was formed. During the night they were completely destroyed. Hundreds of dead lay among the wreckage. The whole road was littered with broken artillery pieces, other weapons, abandoned ammunition. The merciless battle continued until morning, and both sides waited, exhausted, until dawn came to sort out the situation. When dawn broke, the full horror of what had happened became visible. Not only had many Polish soldiers been killed on and near the road, the columns of refugees who had mingled with the troops were also shot by our fire. Dead and wounded horses hung in their harness from broken wagons. Weeping children clutched their dead mothers or the mothers of their dead children. The wounded crawled out of the wreckage and cried out for help. The field dressing station soon overflowed. Poles and Germans together helped the injured. Not a single shot was heard. The war had been suspended. The refugees were unlucky. They were retreating from Poznan and joining the army columns, which they thought would provide them with protection, but they were caught in a meat grinder. That night, for the first time, truly revealed to us the true face of war. Now there was no longer any difference between a soldier and a civilian. Modern weapons had destroyed both. I did not see a single laughing German soldier on the road of death at Olta. Terror had touched them all. The September sun brightly illuminated the blood-drenched road. More than 1,000 Polish prisoners were ordered to remove the rubble. 600 were sent to enemy positions with an offer to surrender. A single anti-tank gun destroyed the enemy's armoured train. The exploding ammunition exploded with a terrible rumble and completely destroyed the train. In the next 2 days, powerful enemy attacks fell on the positions held by the 2nd Battalion of the 33rd Infantry Regiment, the 2nd Battalion of the 35th Tank Regiment, and our regiment. But the Polish attacks were useless. In vain I pleaded with the commander to allow me to expand my responsibilities and take a more active part in the battle. I had to content myself with commanding a company which was scattered throughout our regiment in platoon form. I reminded the commanding officer at every opportunity that I was a tank and motorcyclist, and felt absolutely unnecessary in the position I occupied at the moment. But all to no avail. For the moment I remained a tank fighter. During the night of September 12-13, a strong part of the enemy broke through the positions of the 2nd Battalion of our regiment. An all-out breakthrough seemed inevitable. Early in the morning we received a report that the 6th Leibstander Company had been crumpled and the company commander had been killed. He had always been close to me. We had served in the same regiment since 1929. However, we found it incredible what was reported in the report about the imminent breakthrough. We simply did not believe that the enemy could break through our defensive positions. Having received orders to find out if what the report said was true, I jumped into the driver's seat of a sidecar motorcycle. Along with me went Obersturmführer SS Piefer, and we drove in the direction of Boulogne. After leaving, we quickly rushed along the road of death to get rid of pesky flies as soon as possible. Besides, the corpses of the horses stank. A few hundred meters from Svetkice, I saw 2 Polish soldiers and a soldier of the 6th Company of the Leibstandarte behind a small bridge. The behavior of all 3 soldiers seemed so strange to me that I braked sharply, jumped off the motorcycle and walked towards this group of people standing in the trench. And only when I came to the edge of the trench, I understood the reason for the strange behavior of the German soldier. He had been taken prisoner by these Polish soldiers and was looking at me in amazement as I walked alone towards them. Damn it, I was damn lucky again. Only Pfeffer's Misten 38 automatic prevented the Poles from sending me to the other side of the world. Indeed, our 6th Company had been attacked and defeated. The company commander lay dead in a trench a few hundred meters away. Pfeffer and I proceeded onward to Svetkice and soon found our fallen comrade. His chest was pierced by bullets. Sepulnage died like a true soldier. We will never forget him. The enemy units that had suppressed us were destroyed during the day. The front line was restored. The SS motorized regiment Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler and the 4th Panzer Division of the XV Panzer Corps Dieppe were involved in the battle on the Bzura in order to prevent the dispersed units and formations of the Polish army that were breaking out of the encirclement from crossing the river. The Poles attacked with great tenacity and proved once again that they knew how to die. It would be unfair to deny them courage. The battle on the Bzura was desperate and fierce. The blood of the best of the Poles mingled with the waters of the river. The losses of the Poles were terrible. All their attempts to break through were repulsed by our artillery fire from prepared positions. The resistance of the Poles here was finally broken on September 18, after which we were ordered to attack the fortress in Modlin. Heavy battles with Polish troops trying to break through to Warsaw were fought in the wooded area south of Modlin. The 1st Battalion of the Leibstandarte was attacked and surrounded by superior enemy forces. On September 18 at Sanzao, AM Lieutenant General Reinhardt ordered an attack to rescue our 1st Battalion and also to break through to the Vistula River. The attack was supported by the 2nd Battalion of the 35th Tank Regiment. The viscous sandy roads made movement very difficult, and wheeled vehicles could only move very slowly. Again, a fierce battle ensued, and although the Poles' situation was hopeless, they did not think of surrendering and fought to the last bullet. During the attack, we discovered the remains of SS Obersturmführer Bruckmann and 1 SS Unterführer of the 1st Battalion, Leibstandarte. Both were wounded, taken prisoner, and badly mutilated. Bruckmann was a platoon commander in my company and had gotten married just 2 weeks before the war started. The battle for the old fortress of Modlin began with artillery preparation and attacks by U-87 Stuka dive bombers. This was the first time we had experienced the devastating effects of our dive bombers, and could not understand how the Polish garrison of this old Russian fortress could withstand such a barrage of fire for so long. Contrary to our expectations, the Polish units in Modlin offered stubborn resistance and repulsed all attacks. The fortress fell only at the very end of the campaign. On September 25, Adolf Hitler visited the front to personally see the actions of the 15th Company of the Leibstandarte Zoo. Infantry divisions replaced our tank and motorized formations around Modlin, and the released mobile forces were prepared for the decisive offensive on Warsaw, which began with bombardment and concentration of artillery fire and air strikes on fortifications and main strongholds. The main bombardment of the city began only in the evening of September 26. The Poles were not going to surrender yet. There were still 120,000 Polish soldiers, not counting the militia, to defend the capital. The Poles agreed to surrender the city only on September 27 in the afternoon. That was when almost all fighting on the front ceased. The campaign in Poland was practically over. On September 28, the commander of the 8th German Army, General Blaskowitz, signed the surrender. We listened with amazement to the generous terms offered to the Poles. The officers were left with their swords, and the non-commissioned officers and soldiers were only briefly made prisoners of war. Very soon. On October 1, the SS motorized regiment Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, like many other units and formations, was given the order to move west. All of us were sure that we would follow the march to the banks of the Rhine, but we were mistaken. On October 4, we reached Zeta Prague, where we were allowed to stop for 2 weeks. The regiment was greeted with great enthusiasm by the German population of the city. Thousands of people cheered us when we appeared on Wenceslas Square. Konstantin von Neurath, the Honourable Imperial Governor of the German Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia, made a eulogy in our honour. I again reported to the regimental commander in Prague of my urgent request to be seconded to other duties. My experience in Poland had not been satisfying, and I feared that I would remain the commander of the SS Tank Fighter Company in the regiment for the remainder of the war. At the end of October, I took command of the SS Motorcycle Company. This meant that I would be in the vanguard of the regiment. Although I had long desired this assignment, I was sorry to part with the SS Tank Fighter Company. I had formed my company in 1936 and had become attached to it. Still, it was good to know that I was allowed to take with me a platoon commander and several SS Unterführers. In addition, my faithful chauffeur was also allowed to serve with me in the 15th Company of the Leibstande Adolf Hitler. I was finally in my element. We practiced hard every day. The motorcyclists did it with enthusiasm, and I found full support from them. My slogan, "The motor is our best weapon," was fully supported by my soldiers. In just a few weeks, I had gained the trust of my new company and knew I could rely on each individual motorcyclist. We awaited with interest the further development of events on the Western Front. From Prague, the Western Front, the Blitzkrieg in Poland gave the soldiers hope that the politicians could end this ill-fated war and another military campaign against the Western Allied coalition might be avoided. Our illusory hope was soon dashed when we learned that the Allies had flatly rejected Adolf Hitler's peace proposals in early October. It then became obvious to our soldiers that the war could only be ended by fire and sword. The question of how victory in the war over the Western Allies could be achieved occupied the minds of the young grenadiers as much as those of the most experienced troop commanders. All agreed that defense alone would not achieve the result the country needed, and the viewpoints of commanders and soldiers were unite. If political understanding is impossible, then only a general offensive will give the results we all need. In November, our unit moved to the area of Koblenz and was under the command of General Guderian. We used the experience gained in the Polish campaign and trained soldiers for new tasks. Making plans, exercises and drills continuously followed one after the other. The enthusiasm of the soldiers I commanded encouraged me again. Neither the hardships of the exercises nor the winter cold cooled the zeal of the young soldiers. Combat training continued under the slogan "Sweat saves blood." It is better to dig a 10-meter trench than a 1-meter grave. My company was stationed in empty houses in Bad Ems, located on the banks of the River Lahn. The rugged terrain there was very suitable for our combat training, since we knew that our offensive with Guderian's X6 Panzer Corps would be through the wooded Ardennes, and we would face terrain problems similar to those offered by Westerwald, where we were based. Guderian inspected each company. His exercises in making plans were of particular interest to us. All his remarks served as excellent guidance to us. He said that a tank's engine is your weapon as much as its cannon. Under the command of this extremely experienced commander, we prepared ourselves for the inevitable offensive to the west. On December 24, 1939, Adolf Hitler visited us in Bad Ems. He spoke to the regiment and told us what hopes he had for us. He hinted that soon we would have to march across the battlefields, sprinkled with the blood of our fathers, in the struggle for lasting peace and a strong Europe. In February 1940, we were reassigned to von Bock's Army Group B and moved north. The unforeseen shipment came as a complete surprise. We would have preferred to stay with Guderian. With the transfer, a new phase in our training began. We were attached to the 227th Infantry Division. We, as a motorized unit, were ordered to cross the Dutch border with the start of hostilities, break through the border outposts and reach the IJssel River. The fulfillment of this order required the troops to move at full speed. In order to quickly capture the numerous bridges over the canals and above all over the River IJssel. We practiced constantly enforcing rivers and canals. Soon we had practiced all the situations possible in the course of the battle and were confident that we could cope with the task before us. My unit was stationed in Salzburgen, and I stayed in a priest's house. It was there, on May 1, that I met the famous bishop, Count von Galen, who in a few years would fight for a review of my death sentence and call the attention of the judges to the fact that justice must be based on Christian principles. Count von Galen insisted that my company should receive his blessing. With the coming of the favourable season, the day when we were to commence hostilities was inevitably approaching. Day after day we awaited the code word Anton's School. On May 9, 1940, the code was transmitted and operational readiness was put in place. At 2:05 a.m. on May 10, the next code was given, Danzig. This was the final order to attack the Dutch border fortifications. We left Salzburgen in the dead of night and moved quietly in the darkness. On both sides of the road, there were people waving goodbye to us. They wished us good luck and a speedy return alive and well. The last preparations for the attack were completed at 4 a.m. On May 10, I gathered my young motorcyclists again to remind them of the basic principles of combat operations. As dawn broke on that fateful day of May 10, I promised my soldiers that every officer in our battle group would always be in the line of fire, thus reaffirming the leadership principles we had adopted. In the presence of my soldiers, I shook hands with all my officers to emphasize my promise. The attack began precisely at 5. Our assault force ambushed an outpost near De Poppy and captured the Dutch, who were shocked by the suddenness of the attack. The bridge over the Fetch River was captured by us intact, the assault squad having cut the wires of the explosive devices. Above our heads, countless U-52 transport planes were flying westward. Our comrades in arms from the 22nd Airborne Division and other units were flying to the landing sites. German warplanes, like hawks, were whistling through the air and diving on the predetermined targets. It was as if we were gripped by fever. As soon as the border barrier was removed, the bridge behind it was immediately secured, and then we raced down the smooth asphalt road like race car drivers. Max Wonsche, the 1st platoon commander, raced ahead of his soldiers and drove them forward with his enthusiasm. I followed Wonsche's platoon and was surprised that we met no resistance. Our advance toward Oldenzaal and Hengelo continued at full steam. Concrete tank barriers and bridge railings were unprotected. Some bridges were slightly damaged by explosions, but we were able to drive over them. Dawn entered without a single shot being fired. The inhabitants of Holland stood by the roadside and watched the rapid advance of our troops. The enemy's sappers blew up the bridge over the canal behind Born. But we broke this first resistance of the enemy and forced the canal in a matter of minutes. The doors and walls of neighbouring barns were used for bridges. The most important thing now was speed. All motorcyclists were sent forward to pursue the enemy bomber teams and prevent them from destroying the next bridge. Obersturmführer Kreyers, commander of the 2nd platoon, took it upon himself to pursue the enemy engineer teams. Meanwhile, the temporary bridge under construction had become strong enough to allow motorcycles with sidecars to cross. 37 anti-tank guns were attached to the motorcycles. The swift pursuit continued. Unfortunately, tanks and armoured vehicles temporarily lagged behind. They were providing security for the engineer troops, who were rapidly building a new bridge across the canal. Unfortunately, we were unable to prevent the Dutch bombing team from damaging other bridges as well. These bridges, which had been mined in advance, were blown up. but these bombings could no longer seriously impede our advance. We reached the town of Zwolle without much delay. At about 11:30, the vanguard was already on the outskirts of Zwolle, which meant penetrating 80 kilometers deep into enemy territory. The advance platoon moved to the railroad embankment south of the town and then, behind the embankment, decided to advance further on foot. What a surprise awaited our soldiers the next minute. The wonderful chestnut trees on either side of the road had been cut down to block the entrance to the town. But what good are the best obstacles if they are not guarded by soldiers ready for battle? North of the barricade, just a few hundred meters away, we saw machine gun and long-range firing points, as well as anti-tank barricades. What was most surprising was that their defenders were sitting calmly and nonchalantly on top of these fortifications eating breakfast. They were enjoying the May sunshine, having abandoned their battle stations in dingy casemates and bunkers. 3 barricades prevented us from breaking right through the line of the long-standing fortifications and taking the Dutch by surprise. However, the fire we opened on the calculations of the pillboxes, relaxed and missed our appearance, allowed our soldiers to quickly overcome the space shot from the pillboxes without loss of life. Before the Dutch had time to realize what was happening, our motorcyclists reached the pillboxes and disarmed their grief-stricken defenders. However, it took a lot of effort to remove the trees. Our approaching tanks began to pull the giant trees apart. It took too long to dismantle the barricades, which I didn't like at all. We couldn't give the enemy a moment's hesitation. We had to take advantage of the surprise factor. Without a second's hesitation, I jumped into the Dutch car and raced to Zwolle together with SS Obersturmführer Wunschel and S Grenadier Zeelenwinter. SS Obersturmführer Erich accompanied us on a Dutch motorcycle. I intended to take the commandant of the city by surprise and force him to agree to a ceasefire. The Dutch soldiers stood frozen in the street as we shouted at them and pointed to the barricade of trees where they had been ordered to stay. They dropped their weapons and headed where indicated. The further we got into the city, the more uneasy I felt about this excursion. I wanted to turn back, but it was too late, and I had to continue this game to the end. The sound of firing at the pillboxes could not be heard in the centre of town. Dutch families, enjoying a beautiful May day, scattered like frightened chickens under the shadow of a hawk. Despite the extremely awkward situation, we couldn't help but laugh as we watched the Dutch react. The solid civilian building in the centre of town and the sight of uniformed people entering and exiting it encouraged us to try our luck there. We drove right into the middle of the crowd, braking sharply at the last moment. The car seemed to be about to overturn. In a split second, all our weapons were pointed at the astonished uniformed men. The Dutchman stood as if frozen. A distinguished, honourable gentleman in civilian clothes introduced himself to us as the Queen's representative and said that he would instruct the Dutch troops in Zwolle to cease resistance. He kept his promise. Not another shot was fired at Zwolle. With a few captured Dutch officers, we hurried back to the rubble of trees. Zwolle was ours, but unfortunately we could not prevent the destruction of the large bridges over the IJssel. Both bridges had been blown up as early morning. I nearly had a stroke when I drove up to the dismantled barrier. My soldiers and a few young Dutchmen were having fun riding the merry-go-round with little thought of caution. Meanwhile, the 3rd Battalion of our SS Regiment Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler was forcing the IJssel River 800 meters south of the destroyed railroad bridge at Zutphen. The SS, under the command of SS Sturmbannführer Trabant, attacked Hohen. The village was taken at about 14.0. Our losses were insignificant. The mission of the regimental battle group was accomplished. We reached the River IJssel and partially crossed it. In doing so, the only casualty in my strike group was one soldier who was wounded. A motorcycle gunner, Fleischer, was shot in the leg by a block of trees. During the night, our regiment was recalled from the 227th Infantry Division and placed under the operational control of 18th Army Headquarters. Major General Zickwolf, commander of the 227th Infantry Division, appreciated the regiment's rapid and successful advance. As the first officer so distinguished in this campaign, S. Obersturmführer Krayas received the Iron Cross First Class from the general's hands. Kras and his reinforced platoon advanced about 60 kilometers beyond ISIL and captured 7 officers and 120 soldiers. The advance on Rotterdam and The Hague. After fighting at the ISIL river line, the regiment was ordered to advance toward Hertruidenberg via Hertogenbosch and make contact with the 9th Armoured Division. After minor skirmishes with Dutch infantry, we reached Hertruidenberg near the evening of May 13. Contact with the 9th Armoured Division was established. At 4:00 the next morning we began to advance, passing over the bridge over the Meuse. Thanks to the actions of the parachutists, the bridge was in our hands safe and sound. The paratroopers were scattered across a large meadow on both sides of the bridge embankment during the landing. Many of the brave paratroopers were killed on the approaches to the long-range fire points defending the bridge, but the surprise factor worked here as well. The enemy had no opportunity to destroy this crucial bridge. The way to South Holland and the coast was open. The 9th Armoured Division advanced to the port of Rotterdam and made contact with the 11th Company of the 16th Airborne Regiment. The company was ejected near strategic bridges from gliders, captured these bridges and defended against continuous attacks by the Dutch until the approach of our tanks. Reinforced motorized regiment SS Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, in interaction with the 9th Panzer Division, will pass through or past Rotterdam and then continue the offensive towards The Hague. The regiment was preparing to attack south of Katendrecht. Preparations were completed by 13 points. Rotterdam was to be attacked at 14:40 after an artillery, preparation and bombardment by U-87 Stuka dive bombers and Ne-111 bombardiers. My vanguard moved forward toward the port of Rotterdam and stopped near a large Dutch liner. The vessel had been burning since May 10. Its cargo consisted of American automobiles. At 2 p.m., a rumor was passed that the Dutch were negotiating surrender. The negotiators were General Student, Lieutenant Colonel von Hollitz of the 22nd Airborne Division, and Dutch Colonel Charo. During the negotiations, General Student was shot in the head and taken away in serious condition. Confirmation was required as to whether our terms of surrender had been accepted by the Dutch High Command. I was with a group of officers on the bridge when several groups of Ne-111 bombers approached Rotterdam. The Dutch anti-aircraft guns opened fire on the German planes. The armistice was broken. We tried in vain to attract the attention of our pilots by firing red flares to stop the bombing. We stood in the middle of the target area of the air attack and until the last moment believed that we could prevent it. But, as we later learned, the pilots did not see our flares because of the fog. Thick clouds of smoke from a ship burning at the dock created a smoke screen over the city. When we heard the whistle of falling bombs, we cleared the bridge and hurried to the nearest cellars. That's how it turned out. The bombardment could no longer be stopped. Rotterdam became a sea of fire. The last bomb fell at 15:45. We looked at the burning city and for the first time experienced the horror of an air raid. There was a wall of fire everywhere. It was almost impossible to move through the streets. Our doubts about negotiating the streets of the burning city were dispelled by the order to leave immediately. My vanguard was to contact units of the 22nd Airborne Division in Oversee I. We approached the maze of cluttered streets and searched for a way to Oversee, going deeper and deeper into the burning Rotterdam, covering our faces. People were fleeing this hell to the harbour area. My motorcyclists moved through narrow streets that felt as if they were at the mercy of the devil. The storefronts around us exploded with a crashing crash. Burning dressed mannequins and the jewellery on them created an unearthly picture. Further on, we were already moving through the deserted streets of the city. Not a single Dutchman could be seen. All of them had been driven away by the unbearable heat of the fires. Heavy armoured vehicles moved through a dense veil of smoke, and sometimes only the rear lights of a tank driving ahead or an armoured car following it showed the way. There could be no mistake, for we could not stop. The heat had become unbearable. After we passed the shopping district and reached an alley, I ordered a short stop to give the motorcyclists a chance to catch up with us. Covered in soot with scorched hair but smiling faces, the motorcyclists of the last squad rode out of the burning city, but behind us everything was already blocked by a dense wall of fire. We couldn't turn back, so forward. We cautiously advanced towards Oversee under the protection of the canal dike and were met by Dutch infantry fire. The drawbridge over the canal was raised. However, we quickly blew the drive mechanism. A heavy vehicle drove onto the bridge, and it slowly lowered. Before us stretched the road to the northwest. But what did this straight stretch of road look like? Our planes one by one landed on this wide concreted road. On it were already there and completely disabled, crashed or burned airplanes. These were transport planes of the 22nd Airborne Division, which used this road as a runway when they could not use the airfields intended for them. They became a target for Dutch artillery. Airborne troops steadfastly repelled all enemy attacks for 3 days. A particularly fierce battle was fought in Oversee. We continued to move forward on both sides of the road. The machine gun and rifle fire of the Dutch could not stop us. We searched in vain for survivors of the 22nd Airborne Division, but except for the traces of the battle and the bodies of dead comrades, we could not find a single German soldier. It was only when we had advanced further in the direction of Delft that about 10 soldiers and a lieutenant ran out to us. The young officer hugged me in exhaustion. About 9 p.m., we reached Delft and made contact with the surviving units of the encircled 22nd Airborne Division. Our regiment took 3,536 Dutch prisoners on May 14. The disarming of Dutch troops at The Hague and Scheveningen was completed on May 15, without enemy resistance. The regiment took 163 officers and 7,080 soldiers prisoner. With the capture of the War Ministry, the war in Holland was over for us. Invasion of France. The regiment entered northern France. Having previously passed through Belgian Namur near the Franco-Belgian border at Valenciennes, it first skirmished with French troops. The regiment's task was to prevent the French, cut off in Belgium and northern France, from breaking through to the south. All enemy attempts to do so were suppressed by our fire from quickly prepared defensive positions. The regiment then occupied the front as much as 30 kilometres, not far from the old fortress of Lequenoir. A field from which had just been harvested caused me a sense of unreality. A few hours before, thousands of Frenchmen must have been camped here. Now not a single French soldier was to be seen, but countless French helmets were lying on the vast field as if lined up for a parade. The neatly arranged helmets seemed to me to express the helplessness and weakness of the French army. It was an army without morale or self-confidence. It no longer had the soldiers who had survived the Battle of Verdun. It was an army that fought without faith in its cause and had no clear objectives, unlike us. The battles of the First World War were still fresh in the minds of French soldiers. They believed in the impregnability of their Maginot Line and therefore in the irresistibility of the defenders of this greatest fortification in the world. France not only had the Maginot Line, it also had the greatest tank power. The Allied forces had more than 4,800 tanks at their disposal. These armoured vehicles opposed the 2,200 tanks of the Germans at the beginning of their offensive. The reason for the rapid defeat of the French was, of course, their outdated principles of command. On 24 May, the SS motorized regiment Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler was placed under the operational command of von Kleist's Panzer Group and attached to the 1st Panzer Division. A few days earlier, von Kleist's rapidly advancing Panzer Group had reached the rugged battlefields near the Somme of World War I through November 18, 1916. The advancing Allies lost 794,000 men killed and wounded, taking in 240 square kilometres of territory. Having forded the canals and passed Cambrai, Peronne, Amiens and Abbeville, Kleist was ready to take Boulogne. On May 24, the 1st Armoured Division reached the A River at Hulk and was ordered to advance on Dunkirk. As part of this operation, our regiment attacked Vatten. During the night march, I and my vanguard advanced up the river and onto Vatten Hill, whose 72-metre height allowed us to dominate the surrounding terrain, a swampy lowland. This hill strengthened the enemy defence on the opposite bank of the River A, bridges over which were destroyed, and the British and French troops occupied prepared positions. Under these conditions, the hill could only be seized by a well-thought-out and unexpected attack. That night, the 3rd Battalion of the Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler prepared for the attack. Shortly before it began, the crossing of the A River was suddenly forbidden by Hitler's order. The liquidation of the Dunkirk bridgehead of the enemy was entrusted to the Luftwaffe. All offensive operations of von Kleist's tank group were immediately stopped. We were simply shocked by this order, since we were in the open on the west bank of the A River, and breathed a sigh of relief when we heard about Sepp Dietrich's decision to break through with a fight, despite Hitler's orders. After effective fire training, the 10th Company of the Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler managed to cross the A and reach the outskirts of Wottin on the east bank of the river. Stubborn resistance of the British and French prevented the advance of the crossed units. Only thanks to the attack of the 3rd Battalion Leibstandarte Height was in our hands. The hill, framed by the ruins of an ancient castle, gave us an excellent view to the east. We were standing on the ruins when suddenly the general commanding the Exiv Panzer Corps appeared and demanded an explanation from Sepp Dietrich as to why he was advancing despite the ban. The area west of the River A was perfectly visible from Wotton Hill. This height was at everyone's throat. That is why we decided to seize it. General Guderian approved of Sepp Dietrich's decision. A few moments after this conversation, we were all lying in the mud and had to crawl to save our lives, seeking cover under enemy machine gun fire. The agility with which veteran tankers Dietrich and Guderian disappeared after taking cover in the rubble was astonishing. As a result, Guderian ordered to continue the offensive even further in the direction of Wormeux-Elberg. For the duration of this attack, our regiment was attached to the 20th Infantry Division. On our right was attacked by the 76th Infantry Regiment. Our neighbour on the left was a reinforced Infantry Regiment Greater Germany. The start of the offensive on May 27 was delayed because the bridging of the canal was not completed in time. At 7:45, an enemy attack followed from a small wooded area 2 kilometres east of Vatten Hill, which was repulsed by our artillery. At 8:28, our regiment went on the attack and advanced rapidly. At 10:00, the regimental command post came under enemy heavy artillery fire, which continued until noon. At Boulogne, the 1st Battalion of the Leibstandarte met heavy resistance and, in addition, was subjected to heavy fire from the flank of the Great Germania Infantry Regiment, which weaved behind, and only after a short time was able to secure the flank of our advance. The motorized riflemen were on standby, awaiting the result of the attack. After the capture of Boulogne, my vanguard was planned to release like an arrow from a tight bow and, taking the British by surprise, capture Wormeux. I could not waste any more time, and tried to assess the situation with my own eyes after the attack of the 1st Battalion of the Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler. A motorcycle without a sidecar seemed to me a suitable horse for this purpose. Artillery shelling at the crossroads forced me to ride down the road at full speed. Frayed telephone wires lay on the road, turning the ride into an obstacle race. Suddenly I felt a jolt and, separated from the bike like a rocket, flew toward the tree. From that moment on, I didn't remember anything. Apparently, someone picked me up and took me to the regimental command centre. The not particularly friendly voice of Sepp Dietrich brought me back to reality. In accordance with his orders, I was immediately placed on a stretcher and was instructed by the doctor not to get up in any way, as I had been concussed from the blow. Some time later, while still lying sick, I learned that our unit had begun to move, and I saw my motorcyclists driving in the direction of Boulogne. The deafening roar of the engines of the BMW motorcycles was like music to my ears. My collision with the tree was a thing of the past. I had to lead my soldiers. Unnoticed by anyone, I jumped off the stretcher onto the road and jumped onto the courier motorcycle and quickly passed the company's forward units. Vanguard Group Commander Wunshi greeted me with a questioning look, but he didn't get a chance to ask questions. Roaring my engine, I rolled toward the forward platoon and followed in the direction of Boulogne. My soldiers followed me. They had no idea that I had just gotten off the stretcher. We were met with rifle and machine gun fire from the outskirts of Boulogne. We also came under mortar fire. Mines were bursting on both sides of the road. It was not recommended to stop in such a situation, so we rode at full speed to the entrance to the town. The bikes seemed to fly over the cobblestones of the road. I knew that it only took a few seconds to get past the danger zone, and that my soldiers were following me without hesitation. To the left of the road, I saw a machine gun nest. My motorcyclists were already out of range of its fire. At full speed, we raced past the first houses of the town. Around the bend in the road, we saw the French hastily erecting a barrier of farm machinery. Without firing a single shot, Erich's group managed to disarm the barricade builders. Behind us, motorcycle gunners fired on the gardens to the left and forced the shock defenders of the town to cease firing and gather in the street. 15 enemy officers and 250 privates and non-commissioned officers went down the road as prisoners. We had to report 2 casualties. SS Unterführer SS Peters was killed during the approach, and SS Oberscharführer SS Erich was shot in the thigh. Our daring attack was successful, but I had to hand over command of my vanguard to an aide for a couple of days and obey the doctor's orders. On May 28, the regiment, the 2nd Tank Brigade and the 11th Rifle Brigade moved to the offensive at Wormer. At 10:45, the tanks began moving with the grenadiers. The enemy, by the fire of his heavy artillery, tried to stop our tanks. The enemy had superiority in artillery. He also had numerous infantry units here. Just on the section of the 2nd Battalion Leibstander, 2 regiments of the enemy were detected. I was at the command post of our regiment and was not allowed to leave it without authorization. My motorized riflemen were waiting for developments at Worm. They were to be attached to the operation after the township was taken. The encirclement ring around Dunkirk was getting tighter and tighter. Sepp Dietrich and Max Wunschy went to the 1st and 2nd Battalions of the Leibstandard to get a clear picture of the situation. At 11:50, a messenger returned with the bad news that they were cut off on the eastern outskirts of Eskelberg. The 2nd Leibstander Company attempted to rescue their commander from the critical situation, but they were thwarted by intense machine gun and artillery fire from the enemy. An attack by the 15th Leibstandard Company was also repulsed by fire from the defending brigade. A reinforced platoon of the 6th Company, 2nd Tank Brigade under Lieutenant Corder, lost 4 tanks and was unable to overcome the open space. Lieutenant Corder and Field Officer Krammel were killed a couple hundred meters from Eskelberg. The encircled Sepp Dietrich was clearly visible. He was about 50 meters from the enemy positions. His vehicle was parked at a road obstacle. The staff car was on fire and thick puffs of smoke were rising from the ditch. Fuel spilled into the ditch and dry grass caught fire. While all this was going on, Dietrich and Wunschy, head to toe in mud, fleeing the fire, lay down in a narrow pipe running under the road crossing. 5 of our TIV medium tanks had a platoon of TI. Our light tanks went on the attack in the direction of the outskirts of Eskelberg. The tanks, moving to the left of the road, advancing through the park, which was stubbornly defended by the British. The British set fire to the fuel which they poured on the paths of the park, so that further advance of the tanks became impossible. The entire location of our regiment was subjected to intense artillery fire. Only at about 15.0, the 3rd Battalion of the Leibstande managed to break through to the southeastern part of Wormau. Our commander Sepp Dietrich was finally rescued from his predicament at 16.0 by an assault team of the 1st Battalion of the Leibstandard under the command of SS Hauptsturmführer Ernst Meyer. Sadly, the commander of one of the assault squads, the brave SS Oberscharführer Oberschelp, was killed. Oberschelp was the first non-commissioned officer in the regiment to be awarded the Iron Cross First Class for the Polish campaign. The 2nd Battalion of the Leibstandard was steadily tearing forward, despite the stubborn resistance of the enemy, who stood to the death. Our grenadiers took house after house and at about 17:00 were able to make their way to the market square of Wormer. All enemy counterattacks were repulsed. During a surprise attack by enemy tanks, the commander of the 2nd Battalion of the Leibstandarte, Sturmbannführer Schotzek, was wounded. 2 enemy tanks were hit and caught fire. The regiment took 11 officers and 320 enemy soldiers prisoner. A great number of artillery pieces, vehicles and ammunition were captured at Wormeau. At 23:10, our regiment, supported by tanks, resumed the attack and forced the British to retreat. During the night were taken prisoner 6 more British officers and 430 soldiers of the rank and file. By dawn, the regiment, not meeting serious resistance, came to the road Ostkapelle. Rexpoad, the enemy troops on the regiment's section were completely dispersed and tried to flee northward to Dunkirk, abandoning military vehicles and equipment. Roads leading to the coast and harbour of Dunkirk were completely clogged. Endless columns of British trucks, tanks and guns made it impossible for any movement along them. The amount of military equipment abandoned by the enemy was enormous. The retreat of the British took the character of disorderly flight. At 15:45 from the headquarters of the Exev Panzer Corps was transmitted the order to withdraw from the battle and prepare to march. Motorized Regiment SS Leibstandarte Adolf passed under the operational control of the 9th Panzer Division and was to pursue the enemy fleeing to Dunkirk. But at 18:00, for unknown reasons, this order was cancelled. And again we only watched the British remaining idle. We were not allowed to continue the offensive. It remained to watch the British leave Dunkirk and, under the blows of our aircraft, disappear behind the English Channel. What would have been the future course of the war? If von Kleist's tank group was allowed to continue the planned operation against Dunkirk and take the British Expeditionary Corps prisoner, one can only imagine. The battle against the British was over. We did not participate in the final phase of the Dunkirk operation. On June 4, the regiment was transferred to the command of the 6th Army and was in the area of Cambrai. The Battle of the Somme had begun, and the French positions here were subjected to heavy German attacks, which quickly led to a number of frontal breakthroughs. Our regiment was close by to move towards Amiens or Peronne via the forks of the roads at Bapaume. The enemy had pulled up fresh forces. Probably they were ordered to stop the deep breakthrough of German troops and buy time for the withdrawal of French troops fighting on the Somme, to have time to create a new line of defence behind the Oise. But there was also the possibility that the enemy will try during the night to quickly retreat to the south. Therefore, on June 8, the plan was to attack with 4 divisions and break through in a southwestern direction. The regiment was placed under the operational control of the 3rd Panzer Division. The attack began according to plan. The breakthrough of the French front was extended. On June 9, we were suddenly transferred to the Executive Army Corps section and we ordered to advance to Soissons, Villers Cota, and then in a southeasterly direction. By the time my motorized riflemen crossed the Ina River west of Soissons, they were dead tired. But there was no time for sleep. We had to pass through the forest at Villers-Cota in the night and then come out to La Ferté-Milon. Deep in the night we entered the dark forest and moved slowly along the road, which was badly broken by mines and bombs. The 124th Infantry Regiment camped on either side of the big road in the Doxul forest. Soon we passed our last positions of combat escort and entered no man's land. The French soldiers were voluntarily surrendering. They, for the most part, belonged to the French 11th Division. We were hampered by a thick beech forest, where we expected at any moment to run into the enemy, and every sound seemed to indicate the presence of the enemy. This advance through the forest obviously had a special meaning for Sepp Dietrich. It was here during World War I that he first took part in a tank operation and destroyed his first enemy tank. Around 4:00 we reached Villers-Cota and took some French soldiers prisoner. The whole situation already bore the stamp of the imminent collapse of the French army. The scattered units of the 11th Division of the French offered only weak resistance. At 5:00 we moved in the direction of La Ferté-Milon and in the woods 4 kilometers south of Villers. Kocher captured some more soldiers of the 11th Division. A short distance from El Boulogne, our forward units came under fire from enemy infantry, but then the village was quickly taken. The 1st Battalion of the Leibstande succeeded in taking Chateau Thierry on the move and advanced as far as the blown-up railroad bridge. Chateau Thierry, an important town for the Germans, was abandoned by the French, but heavy artillery fire rained down on its empty streets, turning the sleeping town into a rather uncomfortable place. On June 11, my vanguard proceeded through Brooms and Cologne toward Montreal. We broke through several lines of enemy resistance on the move. I could hardly contain my grenadiers. The throat of the Marne began. 30, we passed through Montreal and took the French by surprise at their wake-up call. They willingly dropped their guns and came out into the main street. At 9.4, we reached the Marne at Serge. Fire from large-caliber machine guns and automatic cannons dispersed enemy columns on the south bank of the river. Even before we ceded our position to the 2nd Battalion of the Leibstande Adolf Hitler and undertook to pursue the already defeated enemy. Although we achieved our objectives, the 2nd Battalion of the Leibstandarte forced the river at Saint-Orge to create a bridgehead, and thus provided the possibility of a subsequent attack on the railroad embankment at the bend of the Marne. At 1850, Mouy was taken, and the embankment was captured. With this bridgehead established, further operations over the next few days proceeded more smoothly, and the enemy was deprived of the possibility of gaining a foothold in the Marne Bend. During the night, the regiment again came under the command of the 9th Panzer Division. At 12:45 a.m., on the unforgettable June 14, we listened to a special broadcast. German troops have been entering Paris since early morning. Soldiers of the 11th Company of the Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler stormed the church in Etrepia and began ringing the bells. We stood silently listening to the solemn ringing. No one cheered, no victory toasts were made, no bonfires were lit. We took it as a fact, and with our eyes saw off the squadrons of our U-87 Stuka dive bombers flying across the Marne and carrying death south of Paris. In the evening of the same day, one of our best junior commanders, SS Hauptscharführer, died a brave death. He became an example for his entire platoon. We continued to advance south through Montmirail and Nevers with orders to establish a bridgehead across the Ailly River near Moulins. The bridge on the highway was blown up by the French before our eyes. The explosion occurred just as a lieutenant of the 10th Infantry Regiment attempted to cross to the opposite bank. The officer fell with the bridge into the swift waters of the Loire. However, we managed to capture the railroad bridge. It was set on fire by the French, but the fire could not destroy the metal structure of the bridge, and we were able to create a bridgehead. The enemy offered only weak resistance. Although at the disposal of the French High Command were still 70 combat-ready divisions, but the French army was no longer willing to fight. We met only isolated pockets of serious resistance. June 19, I received orders to reconnoitre the road from Moulins to Gargnay through Saint-Paul-Saint-Cercil. At dawn, my vanguard advanced through wooded and hilly terrain, clearing the way with cannon and machine gun fire. The retreating French units again tried to create a defensive line to gain time. These attempts did not bother us much. We had only one goal: to advance further south. The flanks became unimportant. We were moving along the roads like a fire-breathing. We couldn't stop. Fire was conducted only from combat vehicles and motorcycles on the move. Our offensive was beginning to look like a wild hunt. About 10:30, we reached a small hill and looked down on Saint-Paul-Saint-Cercil. I moved with the advance party and saw French soldiers struggling to erect a barricade on the road at the entrance to the town. The terrain on both sides of the road was open, and the road sloped for about 800 meters in the direction of Saint-Paul-Saint. These unfavorable terrain conditions prevented a proper attack on the. I therefore decided to take the French by surprise and seize their position by a lightning attack. For this surprise attack, I chose a forward unit under the command of SS Obersturmführer Nittel. I ordered the rest of the attacking platoon to follow 100 meters behind and provide the forward unit with covering fire. The French still had no idea that we were already so close to Saint-Person. They were quietly gathering all sorts of improvised material to barricade the entrance to the town. Suddenly our first motorcycle with sidecar rolled down the hill and sprang like lightning onto the road, firing as it went. The rest of the motorcycles followed at full speed. Armoured vehicles followed on both sides of the road and fired their 20 automatic cannons, clearing the way for the advancing motorcyclists. Mortars pounded the town. In just a few seconds, all hell broke loose. I hurried behind the forward unit and saw fleeing and terrified French soldiers, panic-stricken, rushing out of houses into the street. The frantically gesticulating officers tried in vain to get the soldiers to fight. The shock was too great, and effective defence was no longer possible. Only the bullets from individual rifle shots whistled over our heads. In a short time a breach was made in the French barricade, wide enough for us to pass through. Here the French had mounted a 75 mm gun, but its calculation never had time to open fire, so quickly did our advanced units act. However, the first confusion of the enemy passed, and it was inexpedient to continue the attack on the cars. We were now advancing on both sides of the road on foot. Turning onto the main street of the town, we were met by intense machine gun fire, which made us cautious, but we could not delay any longer. The attack had to be carried out as soon as possible to prevent the bridge at the far end of the town from being blown up. The advance platoon sprinted toward the bridge. The French prisoners ran backward, trying to escape the danger zone. 50 meters from the bridge, the commander of the assault team, Obersturmführer, was wounded in the thigh and barely managed to take cover behind a large elm tree before the debris of the French blown-up bridge flew around us. As soon as the smoke cleared a little, we were met by the fierce fire of the French infantry. The opposite bank of the Saule River was somewhat higher, making excellent conditions for defence. Under the circumstances, we remained in the occupied line, and I asked the battalion following us to pass Saint-Pourçain and attempt to capture the bridge over the Saule River about 12 kilometres to the south. Meanwhile, behind the blown-up bridge, the enemy felt safe and had no idea that his complete defeat was a matter of the near future. At 14 Pointe Jochen Piper, company commander of the vanguard of the 3rd Battalion of the Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, sent a report that the crossing of the Saule was complete. To top it off, an enemy company with all the military equipment was captured. The 3rd Battalion of the Leibstandarte was hastily crossed the river and thrown into the attack on Saint-Person-sur-Saule. The battalion attacked the French from the rear and was able to finish the battle without heavy losses. My vanguard left Saint-Pourçain and pursued the enemy as far as Gannat. By 4 p.m. Gagnin was taken without a fight, and we began to reconnoitre in the direction of Vichy. Powerful blockages of trees on the road Gannat. Vichy did not allow us to fulfill the task before nightfall. Shortly before reaching Vichy, we caught a halted artillery unit by surprise. Its obsolete trucks were unable to climb the steep hill. The guns were obviously left over from World War I and were certainly of little use. They had probably been mothballed in a warehouse somewhere before. The motorized rifle company successfully disarmed the French without casualties and sent them back to Gannat on foot. A demoralized French officer stood on the road, staring gloomily at the guns. I saw that tears were streaming down his cheeks. He stammered out, "What a shame! The soldiers of Verdun should never have let such a thing happen." We found that the bridge over the Allier was intact and made contact with the German troops who had occupied Vichy. On June 19, 17 officers and 933 soldiers were taken prisoner. All of the prisoners looked exhausted and demoralized. June 29. The 2nd Battalion of the Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler went to the city of Clermont-Ferrand and captured 242 aircraft of various types at the airfield. In our hands were 8 tanks, many cars and other equipment. In addition, the battalion captured a major general, 286 officers and 4,075 soldiers. Capture just after the attack began at Pont-du-Château. A French captain volunteered to be a parliamentarian. Despite his white flag, He was killed by French soldiers' gunfire when he equaled the French positions to ask for the surrender of the so-called open town. On June 23, our vanguard moved towards Saint-Étienne and 2 kilometers north of La Fouilleuse came under running fire from behind barricades on the road. The advance unit moved into the undergrowth on either side of the road and attempted to reconnoitre the approach to the far end of the barricades. I moved along the ditch with the 2nd Squad and had barely passed the anti-tank barricade when heavy fire began and a tank rolled out from behind the barricade. It moved through the open space, firing. We, like rabbits, huddled at the bottom of the anti-tank ditch and looked at the oncoming steel hulk. Neither alive nor dead, we watched as the tracks came closer and closer to the edge and seemed to slide down into the concrete ditch. At last the tank stopped right above us, just before the slope of the ditch. The tank and our anti-tank gun engaged in a duel at a distance of only 20 meters from each other. The anti-tank gun fired first, and after the ringing impact we heard the piercing whistle of a ricocheted shell. But the second shell did not penetrate the tank's armor. It was too thick for the shells of our 37mm gun. We saw how the tank rolled right on the anti-tank gun and shot at point-blank range at the gun crew, not reaching only a few meters to the destroyed gun. The tank turned around and went back behind the barricade. We were relieved to see that the second shell had jammed the tank's turret and the crew could no longer properly aim the gun. Unfortunately, 3 tank fighters from the anti-tank gun crew were killed. They were the last of our soldiers to die in the French campaign of 1940. From the forward unit's position, I could see a total of 6 enemy tanks hiding behind the barriers. They were World War I veterans who had been built for the planned and failed offensive of 1919, but had never been in combat. Half an hour later, the tanks were forced to retreat under the shells of our 150mm guns. The road to Saint-Étienne was open. The next morning, the 1st Battalion of the regiment Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler entered the city and captured several hundred more Frenchmen. At 21:45 on June 24, we learned that an armistice had been concluded between Italy and France. The fighting in France was over. Was it the end of the war? The armistice agreement established a demarcation line, and on July 4 we had to withdraw from the occupied territory to the north. Our regiment was then placed under the command of the 12th Army and left for Paris in the early morning. We were to take part in the forthcoming parade. Despite the defeat suffered by the French army, the French population was quite friendly. Shortly before reaching Paris, we learned of the sinking or capture of much of the French fleet by British aircraft carriers, battleships and cruisers in the ports of Oran, Dakar, Alexandria and others. This deeply shocked the French. Never before and never afterward have I seen so many people crying as I did then in France. Churchill's action was seen not as a military action but as a crime. Paris was surrounded by a tight ring of units of von Brisson's division. One could enter the city centre only with permission and a pass from headquarters. I and my motorcyclists took advantage of the opportunity to see the sights of Paris, since the planned parade was first postponed and then eventually cancelled. The regiment left Paris and moved on to Metz. I asked Sepp Dietrich for permission to leave 24 hours early to show my soldiers the blood-stained World War I battlefields near Verdun. Permission was granted, and then about 100 soldiers gathered at Fort Douaumont on July 28, 1940. Together we made our way through the casemates that 24 years earlier had been taken by Hauptmann von Brandis, Oberleutnant Haupt and their brave Brandenburg Grenadiers. We stood, deeply impressed, before a huge casemate, the gates of which had been bricked up and behind which countless German soldiers had found eternal rest. The rugged ground in the area around the ruined Fort Douaumont spoke unequivocally for itself. Rows of craters, the picture of a moonscape. The low grass could not hide the suffering of the land. Trenches crisscrossed the terrain like deep wrinkles. To and between Fort Douaumont and the casemate crypt, we discovered the fresh grave of our fallen battle comrade, who had parted with his young life only a few weeks before. With bare heads we stood at this abandoned grave and looked at the countless graves to our left, dozens upon thousands of wooden crosses lined up in slender rows. Words were powerless to express what we were experiencing. Here were invisible regiments whose former existence was marked by crosses. From the crypt casemate we slowly climbed up to Fort Vaux and tried to imagine the incredible efforts of the German and French soldiers who had lost their lives on this height in June 1916. We climbed to the shell-strewn hilltop on which the fort stood and tried to trace the path of Lieutenant Kiel, who with about 40 grenadiers had marched through the eastern ditch to the centre of the fort on July 2, 1916. We soon gave up this endeavour. It was no longer possible to find anything in the over-excavated ground. At this point, man's penchant for destruction had changed the face of the land. In our imagination, we pictured the dark shadows of the advancing grenadiers breaking through the hurricane fire and the breach in the outer wall of the ditch. We imagined German sappers using flamethrowers against the embrasures, from which the fire was coming and neutralizing the gun crews in the armoured turret. Today that armoured turret lay, broken before our feet. As I told my soldiers of the position the French garrison was in, I thought I could hear the deafening rumble of French artillery trying to overwhelm the German grenadiers who had taken Fort Bock. In the dark corridors of the fort we found traces of fire on the walls and ceilings of the casemates, and recognized the effect of the German flamethrowers. Shocked, we stood at the cistern, which was partly responsible for the fall, after 3 months of fighting, of Fort Vaux, and vividly felt the agony of the French soldiers dying of unbearable thirst. But the Germans, who took the fort on June 7, were in the same position. Sweat and blood were on every bottle of water that entered the fort after passing through a storm of fire and metal. A visit to this historic site turned my comrades into silent listeners. Without uttering a single word, they surrounded me as I told them about the heroic battles of June 8, 1916. The French had attacked 7 times that day, trying to retake but the exhausted Germans fought like men possessed. They were not going to give up the fortress they had taken at the cost of so much sacrifice. At dusk, we passed by way of a group of 21 soldiers and 2 German officers, who had then broken through the barrage of the French and reinforced the defending detachment. These were the remnants of 2 German companies. All others remained on the battlefield. Under cover of night, our vehicles moved in an easterly direction. Visiting the battlefield made us more cautious. Verdun had taught us that, in spite of the 2 campaigns we had endured, we had not yet experienced the terrible hardships our fathers had endured.